The crystal chandeliers cast perfect shadows across the marble floors of Bellacourt, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant. Victoria Chen adjusted her blazer and checked her Rolex, 7:43 p.m. on a busy Friday night. As the newly appointed general manager, she had worked 15 years to reach this moment. What she didn't know was that in exactly 17 minutes, she would make a decision that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria had always been different from other restaurant managers. While her peers focused on profit margins and customer turnover, she obsessed over every detail that made dining an experience worth remembering. Tonight felt particularly important. The restaurant was fully booked. 3 food critics were seated at premium tables, and the owner, Marcus Bellacourt, was flying in from Milan specifically to observe her management style. The evening started flawlessly. Victoria glided between tables, ensuring each guest felt like royalty. She personally greeted the Hendersons, a wealthy couple celebrating their anniversary at table 12, and made sure the sommelier selected their wine with extra care. The kitchen was running like clockwork under Chef Rodriguez's supervision, each plate emerging as a work of art. But Victoria's attention was drawn to table 7, where an unusual scene was unfolding. A young woman sat alone, studying the menu with intense concentration. She appeared to be in her early 20s, wearing a simple black dress that, while elegant, clearly wasn't designer. Her shoes were polished but showed signs of wear, and she carried a modest purse that she kept checking nervously. The woman's name was Sarah Mitchell, though Victoria didn't know this yet. Sarah had been saving for 8 months to afford this dinner, not for herself, but for someone special. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had worked as a line cook at the original Bellacourt location 40 years ago, back when it was just a small family restaurant in Little Italy. Eleanor used to tell Sarah stories about the incredible dishes she helped create, the passion that went into every sauce, and the dream of someday dining there as a guest rather than working in the kitchen. Eleanor had passed away 3 weeks ago, leaving Sarah with a handwritten note tucked inside her recipe box. The note contained a simple request. "Take me to Bellacourt one last time, sweetheart. Let me taste the magic again." Attached was a small envelope containing $300 in carefully saved bills, Eleanor's life savings meant for this exact moment. Sarah had called ahead to make the reservation, explaining to the hostess that she was bringing her grandmother's ashes in a small, elegant urn. The hostess, moved by the story, had assured her that the restaurant would accommodate this meaningful request with complete discretion and respect. As Victoria observed table 7, she noticed Sarah's hesitation. The young woman kept glancing at the prices, calculating something on her phone, and looking increasingly uncomfortable. Victoria's assistant manager, Derek Paulson, approached her with a concerned expression. "Miss Chen, there's a situation at table 7, Derek whispered. "The guest seems underdressed for our establishment. She's been sitting there for 20 minutes and hasn't ordered anything except water. I think she might be having second thoughts about affording the meal." Victoria studied Sarah more carefully. The young woman had placed a small, beautifully crafted wooden box on the table beside her water glass. It was clearly meaningful to her. She kept touching it gently, as if drawing strength from it. "What's in the box?" Victoria asked Derek. "I'm not sure. She mentioned something to the hostess about it being her grandmother, but I didn't get the full story. Should I ask her to move it? It's not exactly standard dining room etiquette." Victoria felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got whenever she had to make difficult decisions that balanced business protocol with human compassion. Bellacourt had strict standards about maintaining its upscale atmosphere. The clientele expected a certain level of exclusivity, and anything that disrupted that carefully cultivated environment could affect the restaurant's reputation. At that moment, Sarah caught Victoria's eye and raised her hand slightly, signaling for service. Victoria made a decision that felt natural to her. She would handle this table personally. Walking over with practiced grace, Victoria smiled warmly at Sarah. "Good evening, I'm Victoria Chen, the general manager. I understand you might have some questions about our menu?" Sarah looked up and Victoria immediately noticed the young woman's eyes were slightly red, as if she had been fighting back tears. "Yes, actually, I was wondering. My grandmother used to work here many years ago, and I wanted to have dinner in her honor. She passed away recently and—" Sarah gestured toward the wooden box. "I brought her with me in a way, is that—" Is that something that would be appropriate here? Victoria felt her heart soften. She had heard countless stories from guests over the years, but something about Sarah's quiet dignity and obvious emotional struggle touched her deeply. Of course. I think that's a beautiful way to honor her memory. What was your grandmother's name? Eleanor Mitchell. She worked in the kitchen back in the 1980s, when this was still the original location. She always talked about the incredible food and the family atmosphere. She saved money for months just so I could experience it myself. Victoria's mind raced. She knew the restaurant's history well. The original Bellecourt had indeed been a much smaller, family-run establishment before Marcus Bellecourt expanded it into the luxury destination it had become. Many former employees had contributed to building the restaurant's reputation for excellence. Your grandmother sounds like she was a special person, Victoria said, pulling out the chair across from Sarah. Would you mind if I sat with you for a moment? I'd love to hear more about her connection to Bellecourt. Sarah's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. Really? You have time for that? Victoria glanced around the bustling dining room. Every table was occupied, the servers were moving efficiently between courses, and everything was running smoothly. She had trained her team well. They could handle the next few minutes without her direct oversight. For a story like this, I always have time, Victoria replied, settling into the chair. Tell me about Eleanor. As Sarah began sharing memories of her grandmother, the way Eleanor would hum while cooking, her incredible knowledge of traditional Italian techniques, and her dreams of returning to Bellecourt as a guest, Victoria found herself genuinely moved. This wasn't just about a meal. It was about legacy, respect, and completing a circle that had been left open for decades. But even as Victoria listened with growing admiration for Sarah's devotion to her grandmother's memory, she was acutely aware of the other dynamics at play in the restaurant. Marcus Bellecourt would arrive within the hour, expecting to see his establishment operating at peak efficiency and maintaining its exclusive reputation. The other guests, many of whom were regulars paying premium prices for an elite experience, expected a certain atmosphere. Victoria realized she was facing one of those pivotal moments that would define not just the evening, but potentially her entire approach to management. The decisions she made in the next few minutes would ripple through the restaurant in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The conversation with Sarah was interrupted by the sharp click of expensive heels approaching their table. Victoria looked up to see Melissa Thornton, Bellecourt's head server and unofficial enforcer of the restaurant's social hierarchy. Melissa had worked at upscale establishments for over a decade and prided herself on maintaining what she called appropriate standards. Ms. Chen, Melissa said with barely concealed irritation, I need to speak with you privately about Table 7. Victoria noticed the immediate change in Sarah's demeanor. The young woman's shoulders tensed, and she instinctively moved closer to her grandmother's wooden box, as if protecting it from an unseen threat. Actually, Melissa, I'm having a lovely conversation with Ms. Mitchell about her grandmother's history with our restaurant. Perhaps whatever you need can wait a few minutes? Melissa's smile became razor-thin. I'm afraid it cannot. We have the Vanderbilt party arriving in 10 minutes, and they specifically requested a quiet, refined atmosphere. Additionally, Mr. Bellecourt just called. He's arrived early and will be here within 30 minutes to observe tonight's service. The weight of Melissa's words settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Victoria understood the implication perfectly. The Vanderbilt family were not just regular customers. They were influential socialites whose approval could make or break the restaurant's reputation among Manhattan's elite. A single negative review from them could cost Bellecourt thousands in lost reservations. Sarah began gathering her purse, clearly preparing to leave. I'm sorry, I don't want to cause any problems. Maybe I should come back another time when it's less busy. Nonsense, Victoria said firmly, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. You have every right to be here, and your grandmother's connection to this restaurant makes you family. But Melissa wasn't finished. She leaned closer to Victoria, lowering her voice to what she believed was a whisper but was clearly audible to Sarah. Look at her clothes, Victoria. Look at how she's been nursing that glass of water for 20 minutes. She obviously can't afford to eat here. And frankly, allowing this kind of charity case to occupy a prime table during our busiest night sends the wrong message to our real clientele. The words hung in the air like a slap. Sarah's face flushed red, and she stood abruptly, clutching the wooden box containing her grandmother's ashes. You're absolutely right, Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. I can't afford this place. I saved for 8 months just to have one meal here, and even then, I can only order the least expensive entree on your menu. I'm sorry for taking up space that could be occupied by someone more worthy." Victoria felt something inside her snap. In that moment, she saw everything wrong with the industry she had devoted her life to. The casual cruelty disguised as professionalism, the way money determined human worth, the forgetting of the very people who had built these establishments from nothing. "Sarah, please sit down," Victoria said, her voice carrying a new authority that made both women pause. "You're not going anywhere." She turned to face Melissa and her assistant manager Derek, who had been hovering nearby, clearly enjoying the drama. "Actually, I think we need to have a conversation about what this restaurant really stands for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." By now, several other staff members had gathered within earshot. James Wright, the sommelier, pretended to organize wine glasses while listening intently. Carmen Rodriguez, the hostess, had abandoned her podium to position herself where she could observe the unfolding scene. Even a few kitchen staff members had found reasons to pass through the dining room. Victoria stood, addressing not just Melissa and Derek, but the growing audience of employees. "Let me tell you all a story about this restaurant that you might not know. 40 years ago, Bellecourt wasn't the exclusive establishment you see today. It was a small family restaurant where hardworking people like Eleanor Mitchell, Sarah's grandmother, created the foundation of everything we now claim as our legacy." Melissa crossed her arms, clearly annoyed by what she saw as an unnecessary lecture. "Victoria, with all due respect, nostalgia doesn't pay the bills. We have a business to run and standards to maintain." "You're absolutely right about standards," Victoria replied, her voice growing stronger. "But what are those standards exactly? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like our standard is to judge people by their wallet rather than their character." Derek stepped forward, apparently thinking he could defuse the situation. "Miss Chen, maybe we could discuss this in your office. The other guests are starting to notice the disturbance." Victoria glanced around the dining room. Indeed, several tables were watching the interaction with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. The Hendersons at table 12 looked particularly uncomfortable, whispering to each other behind their wine glasses. "You know what, Derek? You're right. The other guests are noticing. And maybe that's exactly what needs to happen." Sarah tried once more to leave. "Please, I really don't want to cause a scene. This was supposed to be a peaceful evening honoring my grandmother." "And it will be," Victoria assured her. "But first, I think my staff needs to understand something fundamental about hospitality." She addressed the group of employees who had now openly gathered around table 7. "How many of you came from working-class families? How many of you remember what it felt like to save up for something special, to count every dollar, to worry about whether you belonged in a place like this?" Several staff members shifted uncomfortably. Carmen, the hostess, had grown up in Queens with immigrant parents who worked multiple jobs. James, despite his sophisticated wine knowledge, had started as a busboy at a diner in Brooklyn. Even some of the kitchen staff, watching from the past window, had similar backgrounds. "I thought so," Victoria continued. "And yet somehow, working in this environment has made us forget our own stories. We've become so focused on exclusivity that we've lost sight of inclusion. So concerned with impressing the wealthy that we've forgotten to respect the worthy." Melissa's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Victoria, this is all very touching, but the reality is that this young woman cannot afford our prices. Looking at her, it's obvious she's in over her head. We're doing her a favor by suggesting she might be more comfortable somewhere, more suitable to her budget." The condescension in Melissa's voice was unmistakable, and Victoria saw Sarah flinch as if she'd been physically struck. This was the moment that would later be remembered as the turning point, not just of the evening, but of Victoria's entire career. "You want to talk about what she can afford?" Victoria asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Let me tell you what Sarah can afford. She can afford dignity. She can afford respect. She can afford to honor her grandmother's memory in the restaurant, where that grandmother helped create the very recipes that made us famous." She turned to Sarah, speaking directly to her. "Your grandmother's hands helped shape every sauce we serve. Her knowledge contributed to every technique our chefs now claim as their own. You don't just belong here. This place belongs to you more than it belongs to any of us." The dining room had grown noticeably quieter. Other guests were now openly watching the drama unfold, some with disapproval, others with growing fascination. Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. "Sarah, I want you to order anything you'd like from our menu, anything at all. And I want you to know that tonight's dinner is completely complimentary, with our gratitude for your grandmother's contribution to Bellecourt's legacy." Melissa gasped audibly. "Victoria, you can't be serious. Do you have any idea what Mr. Bellecourt will say when he arrives? We'll all lose our jobs." "Actually, Melissa," Victoria replied, turning back to face her head server, "I think you might be right about someone losing their job tonight." The silence that followed Victoria's words was deafening. Melissa's face went pale, then flushed red with indignation. Derek took a step backward, suddenly realizing that his assumption about safety in numbers might have been gravely miscalculated. "You wouldn't dare," Melissa whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've been with this restaurant for 7 years. I know every VIP client personally. Mr. Bellecourt specifically requested that I handle the Vanderbilt reservation tonight." Victoria's expression remained calm, but there was steel in her voice. "And in those 7 years, what exactly have you learned about hospitality? Because what I just witnessed wasn't service. It was cruelty dressed up in professional language." Sarah had remained seated, but she was gripping her grandmother's wooden box so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Please," she said quietly, "I don't want anyone to get in trouble because of me. Maybe I should just go." "No," Victoria said firmly, never taking her eyes off Melissa. "You're staying. You're going to have the dinner your grandmother dreamed of, and you're going to be treated with the respect every guest deserves." At that moment, Carmen, the hostess, stepped forward. Her voice was hesitant but determined. "Miss Chen, if I may. I actually remember hearing stories about Eleanor Mitchell from some of the older kitchen staff when I first started here. She was legendary for her pasta sauces. Chef Martinez once told me that some of our signature recipes still use techniques she developed." Victoria nodded appreciatively at Carmen, then looked around at the assembled staff. "You see, that's what institutional memory looks like. That's what respect for our history sounds like." James, the sommelier, cleared his throat nervously. "I have to agree with Melissa about one thing, though, Mr. Bellecourt is going to be here any minute, and if he sees this commotion, then he'll see exactly the kind of manager he hired," Victoria interrupted. "Someone who stands by the values that built this restaurant, not someone who abandons them for the sake of appearances." Derek, apparently deciding that his career prospects required him to take a stand, moved closer to Melissa. "Victoria, I think you're making a huge mistake. Our job is to maintain the atmosphere that keeps our high-paying customers happy. We can't run a business on sentiment. Our job," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly, "is to create memorable experiences for every guest who walks through our doors. Not just the ones who meet your arbitrary standards of wealth and status." She gestured toward the dining room, where other guests were now openly staring at the unfolding drama. "Look around you. Do you think this conversation is invisible to our other customers? Do you think they can't hear the way you just spoke to Sarah? What kind of memory are we creating for them?" Melissa seemed to regain some of her confidence, perhaps drawing strength from Derek's support. "Fine, let's talk about memories. What memory do you think we're creating for the Vanderbilt family when they arrive to find their reserved table occupied by someone who, let's be honest, doesn't belong in their social circle?" The cruelty of the statement hung in the air like poison. Victoria felt something fundamental shift inside her, not just anger, but a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. "You know what, Melissa? You're absolutely right. Someone here doesn't belong." Victoria's voice was perfectly controlled now, carrying the authority of someone who had finally found their moral center. "But it's not Sarah." She turned to address the entire group of staff members who had gathered. "I want everyone to understand something. In the next few minutes, I'm going to make some decisions that will fundamentally change how this restaurant operates. Some of you will support these changes, and some of you won't. That's fine. But everyone needs to understand where we stand." Victoria walked over to Sarah's table and gently placed her hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Sarah, I want you to know that your grandmother would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become. The way you've honored her memory, the dignity you've shown in the face of discrimination, that's exactly the kind of character this restaurant should celebrate." She then addressed the wooden box containing Eleanor's ashes. "Eleanor, I never had the privilege of meeting you, but your granddaughter has taught me something important tonight about what real hospitality means. I promise you that she will be treated with the respect and warmth you deserved 40 years ago." Several of the younger staff members were visibly moved by Victoria's words. Tony, one of the newer servers, wiped his eyes discreetly. Maria, a line cook who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, nodded approvingly. But Melissa was far from finished. "This is absolutely ridiculous. Victoria, you're going to destroy everything we've built here. Do you think Mr. Bellecourt invested millions of dollars in this restaurant so you could turn it into a charity kitchen?" "Actually," Victoria replied, "let me tell you what I think Mr. Bellecourt invested in. He invested in excellence. He invested in a reputation for creating extraordinary experiences. He invested in the legacy of a restaurant that has always been about more than just expensive ingredients and exclusive clientele." Derek scoffed. "That's a beautiful speech, but when the revenue reports come in next month and show how much money you've given away in free meals to people who can't afford them, we'll see how long that philosophy lasts." Victoria smiled, not the practiced professional smile she usually wore, but something more genuine and determined. "Derek, you've just revealed exactly why you're not management material. You think hospitality is about extracting maximum profit from every interaction. But real hospitality, the kind that builds generational loyalty and genuine reputation, is about creating value that can't be measured in a single transaction." She gestured towards Sarah. "This young woman will remember tonight for the rest of her life. Not because of the money she spent or didn't spend, but because of how she was treated. She'll tell this story to her children and grandchildren. She'll become an advocate for our restaurant in ways that no amount of advertising could achieve." Melissa laughed bitterly. "And what about the Vanderbilt family? What about the food critics sitting at table 15? What about all the customers who actually pay full price and expect to dine in an environment that matches the premium they're paying? What about them?" Victoria challenged. "Do you think they want to dine in a restaurant where the staff treats people cruelly? Do you think they want to be associated with an establishment that values money over basic human decency?" The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the restaurant's entrance. Through the large windows, everyone could see a black luxury sedan pulling up to the curb. The valet rushed forward to open the door, and out stepped Marcus Bellecourt himself, earlier than expected, impeccably dressed and clearly observing everything happening inside his restaurant. Victoria felt her heart rate spike, but her resolve didn't waver. "Well," she said quietly, "I guess we're about to find out what our owner really values." Melissa's expression shifted from anger to smugness. Perfect timing. Mr. Bellecourt can see exactly what his excellent general manager has been doing with his restaurant. But as Marcus Bellecourt approached the entrance, Victoria noticed something that made her pause. He wasn't rushing in with the urgency of someone responding to a crisis. Instead, he was moving with the measured pace of someone who had been observing carefully and was now ready to engage thoughtfully. The next few minutes would determine not just Victoria's future at Bellecourt, but the fundamental character of the restaurant itself. As the owner pushed through the front doors, every person in the dining room, staff and customers alike, seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see which version of leadership would prevail. Marcus Bellecourt entered his restaurant with the measured confidence of a man who had built an empire from passion and precision. At 62, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who understood that true luxury wasn't about exclusion, it was about excellence. His sharp gray eyes swept across the dining room, immediately assessing the unusual tension that filled the space. Victoria watched as he approached, noting that his expression wasn't one of anger or concern, but rather of intense curiosity. He had clearly observed at least part of the confrontation from outside, and his unhurried entrance suggested he was prepared to understand the full situation before making any judgments. "Good evening, everyone," Marcus said, his Italian accent still faintly coloring his words despite decades in New York. "I couldn't help but notice there seems to be quite an animated discussion happening at table 7. Melissa immediately stepped forward, her professional smile snapping into place like armor. "Mr. Bellecourt, thank you for coming. I'm afraid we've had a rather challenging situation tonight, and I think you should know that Ms. Chen has been—" Marcus raised his hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. "Melissa, I appreciate your concern, but I'd prefer to hear from Ms. Chen directly." He turned to Victoria with an expression that was unreadable. "Victoria, would you mind explaining what's happening here?" Victoria felt the weight of every decision she had made in the past hour settling on her shoulders. This was the moment that would define not just her career but her integrity. She looked at Sarah, still clutching her grandmother's ashes, then at the staff members who had gathered to witness this confrontation, and, finally, at Marcus himself. "Mr. Bellecourt, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell. Her grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, worked in our kitchen 40 years ago back at the original location. Sarah came here tonight to honor Eleanor's memory by having dinner at the restaurant her grandmother helped build." Marcus's expression shifted with recognition. "Eleanor Mitchell. Yes, I remember her well. She was extraordinary with traditional sauces. My father spoke of her often." He approached Sarah's table with genuine warmth. "Please, don't get up. I'm honored to meet Eleanor's granddaughter." The change in atmosphere was immediate and electric. Melissa's confident expression faltered, and Derek suddenly looked like he wished he could disappear entirely. Sarah looked up at Marcus with surprise and growing hope. "You actually remember my grandmother?" "Of course I do," Marcus replied, settling into the chair beside her. "She taught my head chef at the time a technique for reducing wine and tomato sauces that we still use today. She was a true artist." He gestured toward the wooden box. "I assume Eleanor is with us tonight?" Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "She saved money for months so I could experience Bellecourt as a guest. She always talked about the respect and passion that went into every dish." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could see him processing not just Sarah's story, but the broader implications of what had transpired. When he spoke again, his voice carried a gravitas that commanded attention from everyone in the vicinity. "Sarah, your grandmother was part of the foundation upon which everything you see here was built. The recipes she helped perfect, the standards she maintained, the dedication she brought to her work, all of that lives on in this restaurant." He paused, then looked directly at Victoria. "I assume Miss Chen has made sure you've been treated accordingly?" Before Victoria could answer, Melissa interjected with barely controlled desperation. "Mr. Bellecourt, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the situation. The young lady has been here for over an hour without ordering, and frankly, it's become clear that she's not in a financial position to dine here. We were simply trying to maintain the standards that our regular clientele expects." The silence that followed Melissa's words was crushing. Marcus slowly turned to look at her, and his expression had transformed from warmth to something much colder. "I see," he said quietly. "And what standards would those be exactly?" Derek, apparently sensing that solidarity might be his only hope, stepped forward to support Melissa. "Sir, we have the Vanderbilt party arriving any moment. 3 food critics dining tonight, and frankly, this situation has created quite a disturbance. We were simply trying to preserve the atmosphere that makes Bellecourt special." Marcus stood up, and his presence seemed to fill the entire dining room. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You've spent the evening treating the granddaughter of one of our founding kitchen staff with disrespect because you determined she couldn't afford to eat here." Melissa's voice became strained. "Mr. Bellecourt, with all due respect, we have to be practical about our business model. We can't afford to—" "Stop," Marcus said, and the single word carried such authority that not just Melissa, but the entire restaurant seemed to freeze. "Let me tell you what we can't afford. We can't afford to forget where we came from. We can't afford to treat people as disposable based on their bank accounts. And we certainly can't afford to have staff members who don't understand that hospitality is about honor, not just profit." He walked over to where Victoria stood, and for a terrifying moment she wondered if her defense of Sarah had cost her everything. But when Marcus spoke, his words surprised everyone. "Victoria, I want to thank you for upholding the values that this restaurant was built on. In a moment when it would have been easier to prioritize immediate business concerns, you chose to defend something more important: the legacy of respect and dignity that separates true hospitality from mere service." The relief Victoria felt was overwhelming, but Marcus wasn't finished. He turned back to face Melissa and Derek, and his expression had become granite hard. "However, I cannot and will not tolerate staff members who believe that cruelty is an acceptable business practice." Melissa's face went white. "Mr. Bellecourt, surely you're not going to let one isolated incident—" "Isolated?" Marcus interrupted. "Do you think this is the first time you've made someone feel unwelcome based on your perception of their financial status? Do you think your attitude towards Sarah tonight appeared out of nowhere?" Derek tried to interject. "Sir, if we could just discuss this privately." "No," Marcus said firmly. "This conversation happens here, in front of the staff and guests, because the values of this restaurant aren't private matters. They're public commitments. He addressed the gathered employees, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Everyone who works at Bellecourt needs to understand something fundamental. We don't serve food to people who can afford us. We serve food to people who choose to share a meal with us. There's a profound difference. Marcus walked back to Sarah's table and gently touched the wooden box containing Eleanor's ashes. Eleanor Mitchell understood this difference. She cooked with love and respect for every dish that left the kitchen, regardless of who would eat it. That's the standard I expect from every person who works here. He straightened up and looked directly at Melissa and Derek. Unfortunately, some people have lost sight of that standard. Melissa, Derek, your employment at Bellecourt is terminated, effective immediately. The gasps that rippled through the dining room were audible. Several other guests had now openly turned in their chairs to watch the unprecedented drama unfold. Melissa's composure finally cracked completely. You can't be serious. I've dedicated 7 years to this restaurant. The Vanderbilt reservation will be handled by staff members who understand that every guest deserves respect, Marcus said coldly. Please collect your belongings and leave immediately. Derek's face had gone ashen. Mr. Bellecourt, please reconsider. I was just following established protocols. No, Marcus replied. You were following prejudices disguised as protocols. There's a difference, and that difference is exactly why you no longer work here. As the two disgraced employees began their humiliated exit, Marcus turned his attention back to Sarah. Now then, Ms. Mitchell, I believe you came here to have dinner with your grandmother. Victoria, please make sure Sarah experiences the very best that Bellecourt has to offer, with my personal compliments and gratitude. The transformation in the restaurant's atmosphere was immediate and remarkable. The remaining staff moved with renewed purpose and dignity, and even the other guests seemed to settle back into their meals with a sense that they had witnessed something important. Not just a firing, but a reaffirmation of values that elevated the entire establishment. The departure of Melissa and Derek created a vacuum that was immediately filled by a sense of renewed purpose among the remaining staff. Victoria watched as Carmen smoothly took over the hosting duties. James began crafting a special wine pairing for Sarah's dinner, and the kitchen staff worked with visible enthusiasm to prepare what they knew would be a meaningful meal. Marcus settled back into his chair beside Sarah, his demeanor having shifted from the stern authority he had displayed moments before to the warm hospitality of a gracious host. Sarah, I hope you'll forgive the theatrics. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made publicly to ensure everyone understands the principles we operate by. Sarah shook her head, still somewhat overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. I never expected anything like this. I just wanted to have a quiet dinner in my grandmother's honor. And you shall, Marcus assured her. But first, I'd like to hear more about Eleanor. You see, when my father passed away and I took over the restaurant, I inherited not just a business, but a collection of stories and relationships. Eleanor was part of those early stories that shaped who we became. As Sarah began sharing more detailed memories of her grandmother, Eleanor's meticulous attention to seasoning, her ability to transform simple ingredients into extraordinary dishes, her dreams of someday returning to Bellecourt as a guest, Victoria found herself deeply moved by the connection being forged between past and present. Marcus listened intently, occasionally nodding with recognition. Your grandmother sounds like she understood something that many professional cooks never grasp, that cooking is an act of love, not just technique. She helped establish a culture in our kitchen that persists to this day. Meanwhile, Victoria began to process the broader implications of what had just occurred. The firing of 2 senior staff members during the restaurant's busiest service could have been catastrophic, but instead, the remaining team seemed energized by the clarity of purpose Marcus had provided. Tony, the young server who had been visibly moved earlier, approached Victoria with newfound confidence. Ms. Chen, I want you to know that what you did tonight, standing up for Ms. Mitchell, that's the kind of leadership that makes me proud to work here. Maria, the line cook, emerged from the kitchen to personally oversee the preparation of Sarah's meal. I want to make sure this dinner honors Eleanor's memory, she told Victoria. My grandmother also worked in restaurant kitchens, and I know how much pride she took in her work. The ripple effects of the evening's events were becoming visible throughout the dining room. Other guests, who had initially seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation, now appeared to regard their dining experience with renewed appreciation. The Hendersons at table 12 sent a bottle of champagne to Sarah's table with a note expressing their admiration for the restaurant's values. Victoria realized that what could have been a public relations disaster had instead become a powerful demonstration of authentic hospitality. The guests weren't just witnessing excellent service, they were participating in a moment of genuine human connection that elevated the entire experience. Chef Rodriguez emerged from the kitchen personally carrying Sarah's appetizer, a delicate burrata with heirloom tomatoes and basil that had been prepared with exceptional care. "This dish uses a technique your grandmother taught us for selecting the perfect tomatoes," he explained to Sarah. She believed that every ingredient tells a story, and the chef's job is to honor that story. As Sarah tasted the dish, tears streamed down her face. "This is exactly what my grandmother described. Not just the flavors, but the love and respect that goes into every element." Marcus watched this interaction with deep satisfaction. "This is what I mean when I talk about institutional memory," he told Victoria. "It's not just about preserving recipes or techniques. It's about maintaining the emotional and spiritual connections that make a restaurant more than just a place to eat." The arrival of the Vanderbilt party, which had been such a source of anxiety for the fired staff, became another opportunity to demonstrate the restaurant's renewed focus on genuine hospitality. Carmen greeted them with sincere warmth, briefly explaining that they would be experiencing service from a team that had just recommitted to the restaurant's founding principles of respect and excellence. Rather than being put off by this transparency, the Vanderbilt family seemed intrigued and impressed. Victoria overheard Mrs. Vanderbilt commenting to her husband, "How refreshing to dine somewhere that actually stands for something meaningful." As the evening progressed, Sarah's dinner became a celebration that extended far beyond her individual table. James had crafted a wine pairing that told the story of Italian immigrant families in New York, with each glass representing a different era of the city's culinary evolution. The kitchen prepared additional courses that showcased techniques and recipes that connected to Eleanor's legacy. Other diners began to engage with the story as well. A food critic from Table 15 approached Sarah during her dessert course, asking permission to write about the evening's events. "What I witnessed tonight," the critic explained, "was the difference between performative exclusivity and authentic hospitality. That's a story worth telling." Victoria found herself in conversation with Marcus as the evening wound down. "I have to ask," she said, "were you really surprised by what you found when you arrived tonight, or had you been aware of issues with Melissa and Derek's approach to service?" Marcus smiled knowingly. "Victoria, I've been in this business for over 30 years. I can usually sense when staff members have lost sight of our core values. What surprised me wasn't that the confrontation happened. It was that you handled it with such integrity and courage." He gestured toward Sarah, who was now engaged in animated conversation with several other guests who had been drawn to her table by the story of Eleanor's legacy. "Look at what you've created here. This isn't just a meal. It's a community experience that everyone in this dining room will remember for years to come." Victoria realized that the evening had fundamentally changed her understanding of what leadership meant in the hospitality industry. "I was terrified that standing up for Sarah would cost me my job," she admitted. "And that fear," Marcus replied, "is exactly what separates managers from leaders. A manager protects their position by avoiding difficult decisions. A leader protects their values by making difficult decisions, regardless of personal cost." As the evening drew to a close, Sarah carefully packed her grandmother's ashes back into the wooden box, but her demeanor had transformed completely. Where she had entered the restaurant nervous and uncertain, she now carried herself with the confidence of someone who had been truly welcomed and honored. "Victoria," Sarah said as she prepared to leave, "I know my grandmother would have been so proud of what happened here tonight. Not just the meal, which was extraordinary, but the way you stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to look the other way." Victoria hugged Sarah goodbye, understanding that this evening had created a bond that extended far beyond a single dining experience. "Your grandmother's legacy lives on not just in our recipes, but in the reminder that every person who enters this restaurant deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." As the last guest departed and the staff began closing procedures, Victoria reflected on how a single evening had redefined everything she thought she knew about success in the restaurant industry. The firing of 2 staff members, which should have been a crisis, had instead become a catalyst for renewed purpose and authentic community building. Marcus approached her one final time before leaving. "Victoria, I want you to know that tonight confirmed something I suspected when I hired you. you understand that our real product isn't food, it's human connection. That understanding will serve you well as you continue to grow in this industry." The restaurant fell quiet as the last lights dimmed, but the impact of the evening's events would resonate far beyond the closing of service. Victoria had learned that true hospitality requires the courage to defend dignity over profit, and that authentic leadership means standing for values even when the cost seems too high to bear. 3 months after the events that would come to be known among Bellecourt staff as the night everything changed, Victoria stood in her office reviewing the restaurant's performance metrics with a mixture of amazement and vindication. The numbers told a story that even the most profit-focused business analyst would find compelling. Reservations had increased by 43% since that fateful evening. More significantly, customer retention rates had soared to levels Victoria had never seen in her 15-year career. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Eleanor's legacy had spread throughout Manhattan's dining community, creating a reputation for Bellecourt that transcended mere culinary excellence. The food critic who had witnessed the evening's events had published a review titled "Where Hospitality Meets Humanity," which had been reprinted in 3 major publications and shared thousands of times on social media. But it wasn't just the publicity that had transformed the restaurant. It was the fundamental shift in how the staff approached their work. Carmen had been promoted to assistant manager, bringing to the role a natural warmth and intuitive understanding of what made guests feel truly welcome. Her background growing up in Queens with immigrant parents had given her insights into dignity and respect that proved invaluable in training new staff members. The replacement hires for Melissa and Derek had been carefully selected not just for their technical skills, but for their alignment with the restaurant's renewed emphasis on inclusive hospitality. Jessica Palmer, the new head server, was a former social worker who had transitioned into fine dining because she wanted to create positive experiences for people. Robert Kim, the new assistant manager, had grown up helping in his family's small restaurant and understood that every guest represented someone's special occasion. Victoria's management style had evolved as well. The confidence she had gained from standing up for her principles had made her more decisive in other areas, more willing to trust her instincts about what truly mattered for long-term success. The transformation wasn't limited to staff changes. Marcus had approved several initiatives that Victoria proposed to honor the restaurant's working-class roots while maintaining its reputation for excellence. They had established the Eleanor Mitchell Scholarship, providing culinary training opportunities for young people from underserved communities. Once a month, Bellecourt hosted legacy dinners, where former employees and their families were invited to dine as honored guests. These initiatives had an unexpected side effect. They attracted a new category of clientele. Wealthy diners who could afford to eat anywhere began choosing Bellecourt specifically because of its values-driven approach. They brought their business associates, their family celebrations, and their charitable events to a restaurant that stood for something meaningful. Sarah Mitchell had become an unofficial ambassador for the restaurant. She returned monthly for dinner, often bringing friends who wanted to experience the place where her grandmother's memory had been so beautifully honored. Her visits had become special occasions for the entire staff, who had adopted her as part of the Bellecourt family. But perhaps the most significant change was in the kitchen itself. Chef Rodriguez had been inspired by the renewed focus on legacy and tradition to research and recreate more of the original recipes that employees like Eleanor had helped develop. The menu now featured a heritage collection that told the story of the restaurant through the dishes created by its founding kitchen staff. Victoria was reviewing these developments when Marcus entered her office, carrying 2 espresso cups and wearing the satisfied expression of a business owner whose investment had proven even more successful than anticipated. "The quarterly reports are in," he announced, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Revenue is up 38% over last year, but more importantly, our profit margins have actually improved despite all the complimentary dinners and community initiatives." Victoria accepted the espresso gratefully. It turns out that treating people with dignity is actually good for business. Who would have thought? Marcus laughed. Anyone who understands the difference between short-term profit extraction and long-term value creation. What you demonstrated that night, and what we've built on since then, is that authentic hospitality creates customer loyalty that no amount of marketing could achieve. He pulled out his phone and showed Victoria a social media post. "Look at this review from last night." A customer wrote, "Bellecourt doesn't just serve exceptional food, they serve exceptional humanity. Every member of their staff treats every guest like family, regardless of background or budget. This is what fine dining should be. Victoria read the review with growing pride, but Marcus wasn't finished. That's not an isolated sentiment. We're seeing similar comments consistently. People are choosing us not just for the food, but for the experience of being part of something meaningful. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Carmen appeared, looking excited. "Miss Chen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here who specifically asked to speak with you." Victoria followed Carmen to the front of the restaurant, where she found a well-dressed woman in her 50s, accompanied by a teenage boy who bore a striking resemblance to someone Victoria couldn't quite place. "Miss Chen?" the woman asked. "I'm Patricia Williams, and this is my son David. We heard about what happened here a few months ago with Sarah Mitchell, and, well, David's great-grandmother also worked at the original Bellecourt location." The resemblance clicked into place. David had the same thoughtful eyes and gentle demeanor that Victoria remembered from Sarah's visit. "Please," Victoria said, "let's sit down and talk." As they settled at a corner table, Patricia explained that David's great-grandmother, Rosa Williams, had been a prep cook at Bellecourt in the 1970s. Like Eleanor Mitchell, Rosa had contributed techniques and recipes that had become part of the restaurant's foundation, but her family had never felt welcome to return as guests. "When we read about how you honored Eleanor's memory and treated Sarah with such respect," Patricia continued, "we realized that maybe it was time to reconnect with that part of our family history." David, who had been quiet during his mother's explanation, finally spoke up. "My great-grandmother used to tell me stories about the restaurant. She said it was like a laboratory where she could experiment with flavors and techniques. She always talked about maybe going back someday, but—" He trailed off, the implication clear. Victoria felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had driven her actions 3 months earlier. "David, your great-grandmother was part of the foundation that built everything you see here. You're not just welcome, you're family." Marcus, who had followed them from the office, overheard the conversation and immediately joined them. "Rosa Williams. Yes, I remember my father mentioning her. She developed a technique for braising short ribs that we still use in our winter menu." The evening that followed became another celebration of legacy and connection. Chef Rodriguez prepared a special tasting menu that included dishes influenced by Rosa's techniques, while James crafted wine pairings that honored the Italian immigrant experience in New York. But what struck Victoria most was how the other guests in the restaurant responded to David and Patricia's story. Rather than being annoyed by the attention given to this family celebration, the other diners seemed genuinely moved to be part of something meaningful. Several couples approached their table to share their own stories of family members who had worked in the restaurant industry. As the evening progressed, Victoria realized that the transformation of Bellecourt had created something she hadn't anticipated, a gathering place where people could connect with their own histories and values. The restaurant had become more than a business. It had become a community institution that reminded people of what was possible when dignity and respect guided human interactions. Dialogue. By the time Patricia and David left, promising to return with more family members who wanted to experience the restaurant where Rosa had worked, Victoria understood that the decision she had made 3 months earlier had set in motion changes that extended far beyond a single evening or even a single business. The story of Eleanor Mitchell, Sarah's courage, and Victoria's stand for principles had created ripples that would continue to expand, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that might never be fully measured but would certainly never be forgotten. 6 months later, Victoria stood before a packed auditorium at the International Hospitality Management Conference in Chicago, addressing an audience of restaurant owners, managers, and industry professionals who had come to hear about what hospitality journals were calling the Bellecourt Revolution. The invitation to speak had come as a surprise. Victoria had never considered herself a thought leader or industry guru. She was simply a manager who had made a decision to prioritize human dignity over profit margins. But apparently that decision had resonated far beyond the walls of a single Manhattan restaurant. "When I walked into work 6 months ago," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "I thought I understood what success looked like in our industry. High profit margins, exclusive clientele, pristine Yelp reviews, and the kind of reputation that keeps reservation books full months in advance." She paused, scanning the faces in the audience. seasoned veterans who had built restaurant empires, young entrepreneurs launching their first concepts, corporate executives from major hospitality chains. What I learned that night was that I had been measuring success by all the wrong metrics. The story she told that afternoon would be recorded, transcribed, and shared across industry publications for years to come. But more immediately, it sparked a transformation in how many audience members thought about their own businesses. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a hospitality professor from Cornell who was in attendance, would later write in her research paper, Chen's presentation represented a paradigm shift from transactional hospitality to transformational hospitality, the difference between extracting value from customers and creating value with them. But Victoria's influence extended beyond academic circles. Marcus had been fielding calls from restaurant owners across the country who wanted to understand how implementing similar values-driven approaches might benefit their own establishments. 3 weeks after the conference, Victoria received a call that would challenge her in entirely new ways. Margaret Thompson, CEO of Thompson Hospitality Group, a chain of 12 upscale restaurants across the Northeast, wanted to hire Victoria as their director of hospitality culture. "We've built a successful business model," Margaret explained during their initial phone conversation, "but we've lost something essential along the way. Our restaurants are profitable, but they lack soul. Our staff turnover is high, our customer loyalty is declining, and frankly, none of us feel particularly proud of what we've created." The offer was compelling: significantly higher salary, equity in the company, and the opportunity to implement systemic changes across multiple locations. But it also meant leaving Bellecourt, the place where she had discovered her true leadership voice. Victoria discussed the opportunity with Marcus over dinner at Bellecourt, sitting at the same table where Sarah Mitchell had honored her grandmother's memory months earlier. "It's an incredible opportunity," Marcus acknowledged, though his expression suggested mixed feelings. "Thompson Hospitality Group has restaurants in markets we've never entered. You could influence thousands of employees and hundreds of thousands of guests." Victoria swirled the wine in her glass, considering the implications. "But what if I can't recreate what we've built here? What if the magic was specific to this place, this history, this particular combination of circumstances?" Marcus smiled knowingly. "Victoria, do you think what happened here was about magic, or was it about principles? Because principles can be applied anywhere, by anyone who has the courage to stand by them." The conversation was interrupted by Carmen, now confidently managing the evening service, who approached with a concerned expression. "Ms. Chen, there's a situation at table 9 that I'd like your advice on." Victoria followed Carmen to a table where a young couple sat looking uncomfortable and out of place. The woman was clearly pregnant, and both appeared to be in their early 20s. Their clothes were clean but inexpensive, and they were studying the menu with the kind of careful attention that suggested they were calculating every dollar. "They've been here for 30 minutes, Carmen explained quietly, "and they keep talking about leaving. I can tell they're worried about the prices, but they also seem like this dinner is really important to them." Victoria approached the table with the confidence that had become her trademark. "Good evening, I'm Victoria Chen, the general manager. I couldn't help but notice you might have some questions about our menu." The young man looked up nervously. "Actually, we were just realizing that maybe this place is a bit beyond our budget. We should probably go." "Before you do," Victoria said, settling into the chair beside them, "could you tell me what brought you here tonight?" "I ask because every guest has a story, and I've learned that those stories are often more important than anything else." The woman exchanged glances with her partner, then spoke hesitantly. "We just got engaged last week, and Tom wanted to celebrate somewhere special. His father recommended Bellecourt before he passed away last year. He used to tell Tom about this amazing Italian place where they treated everyone like family." Victoria felt the familiar stirring of purpose. "What was your father's name, Tom?" "Anthony Russo. He was a contractor who worked on some restaurant renovations in the city. He always said that someday, when he could afford it, he'd take my mom here for their anniversary." Victoria's mind raced through the restaurant's history. She didn't immediately recognize the name, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Tom's father had carried a dream connected to Bellecourt, and that dream was now being passed to the next generation. "Tom, your father sounds like he understood what makes a place special, not just the food, but the way people are treated." Victoria made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. Tonight, you and your fiancé are going to experience exactly what your father imagined. With our compliments and our gratitude for choosing to celebrate your engagement with us." The transformation that followed was becoming familiar to Victoria, but it never lost its emotional impact. The young couple's anxiety melted away, replaced by joy and gratitude. Other guests, witnessing the interaction, seemed to glow with the reflected warmth of authentic human connection. As Victoria returned to her conversation with Marcus, she realized that the decision about Thompson Hospitality Group had become clear. "I need to take the job," she told him, "not because I want to leave Bellecourt, but because what we've learned here needs to reach more people. There are thousands of restaurant workers who have never experienced the kind of leadership that prioritizes their dignity. There are millions of guests who have never been treated with the respect they deserve." Marcus nodded slowly. "I suspected you would reach that conclusion. It's going to be painful to lose you, but I understand that some lessons are too important to keep contained." 2 weeks later, Victoria walked into the Thompson Hospitality Group headquarters in Boston, carrying with her not just management expertise, but a fundamental belief in the transformational power of authentic hospitality. Her first meeting with the company's 12 general managers revealed the challenges she would face. These were experienced professionals who had built their careers on efficiency, profit optimization, and maintaining the kind of exclusivity that generated premium pricing. "Look," said Robert Chen, GM of their flagship Boston location, "what you did at Bellecourt makes for a nice story, but we operate at a different scale. We can't afford to give away free meals every time someone has a sob story." Victoria spent the next 3 hours sharing not just the story of Sarah Mitchell, but the data that proved values-driven hospitality was actually more profitable in the long term. Customer retention rates, positive review percentages, staff turnover costs, word-of-mouth marketing value. Every metric supported the business case for treating people with dignity. But more importantly, she shared stories from the dozens of similar situations that had occurred at Bellecourt since that pivotal evening. The elderly veteran who had been treated with special honor on Veterans Day. The single mother celebrating her daughter's graduation. The couple from Ohio who had saved for 2 years to dine at a, quote, fancy New York restaurant and had been made to feel like celebrities. Each of these interactions, Victoria explained, created advocates who told the story to friends, family, and colleagues. They generated more positive publicity than any advertising campaign we could have afforded. Jennifer Walsh, GM of their Hartford location, raised her hand. "But how do you scale that kind of personal attention? How do you train staff to identify these situations and respond appropriately?" Victoria smiled. "That's exactly what we're here to figure out together." The next 6 months would prove to be the most challenging and rewarding of Victoria's career. She developed training programs that taught staff to recognize not just the obvious signs of financial distress, but the subtle cues that indicated when guests felt unwelcome or out of place. She implemented policies that empowered every employee, from dishwashers to assistant managers, to make decisions that prioritized guest dignity over short-term profit. She created recognition programs that celebrated staff members who went above and beyond to create meaningful experiences. Most importantly, she established a culture where every team member understood that their primary job wasn't to serve food or process payments. It was to create moments of human connection that guests would remember and treasure. The results exceeded even Victoria's optimistic projections. Within 6 months, Thompson Hospitality Group restaurants were reporting increased revenue, improved staff retention, and customer loyalty scores that set new industry benchmarks. But for Victoria, the real measure of success wasn't found in quarterly reports or performance metrics. It was found in the stories that emerged from each location, stories of dignity restored, connections made, and dreams honored. The young couple from Tom's engagement dinner had returned to Bellecourt for their wedding reception, bringing 30 family members who wanted to experience the restaurant where they had felt so welcomed. Sarah Mitchell had started a blog documenting her monthly visits to Bellecourt, which had become required reading for hospitality professionals worldwide. And somewhere in Manhattan, at Table 7 in a bustling restaurant, new stories were being written every night, stories of human dignity, authentic connection, and the transformational power of treating every person with the respect they deserve. Victoria had learned that leadership wasn't about managing processes or optimizing outcomes. It was about creating environments where people, both staff and guests, could experience the best versions of themselves. The revolution that had started with a single decision to defend an unwelcome guest had become a movement that was reshaping how an entire industry thought about success, profit, and the fundamental purpose of hospitality. 2 years after leaving Bellecourt, Victoria stood in the kitchen of Thompson Hospitality Group's newest location in Philadelphia, watching as Maria Santos, a former dishwasher she had promoted to sous chef, put the finishing touches on a special dinner that would change both their lives forever. The restaurant industry had taken notice of what was now being called the Chen Method, a hospitality philosophy that had transformed struggling establishments into community landmarks across the Northeast. Tonight, however, wasn't about industry recognition or business metrics. Tonight was about coming full circle. Sarah Mitchell, now 24 and working as a social worker in Philadelphia, had reached out to Victoria with an unusual request. She wanted to organize a reunion dinner, bringing together all the people whose lives had been touched by that pivotal evening at Bellecourt. But more than that, she had a surprise that would honor her grandmother's memory in a way no one could have anticipated. The guest list read like a testament to the ripple effects of authentic leadership. Marcus Bellecourt had flown in from Milan, where he was consulting with restaurants across Europe about implementing dignity-driven service models. Carmen had opened her own small bistro in Queens, using the management principles Victoria had taught her. Even Chef Rodriguez had come, bringing recipes he had developed that were directly inspired by Eleanor Mitchell's techniques. But the most significant attendee was Dr. James Mitchell, Eleanor's son and Sarah's uncle, a retired culinary historian who had spent the past 2 years researching his mother's contributions to New York's restaurant scene. When Sarah told me what happened at Bellecourt, Dr. Mitchell explained to Victoria as they prepared for the evening, I realized I had never properly documented my mother's legacy. So I began interviewing former colleagues, tracking down recipes, and piecing together the true scope of her influence. He handed Victoria a leather-bound manuscript. This is more than just a cookbook. It's a historical record of how immigrant women like my mother shaped American cuisine, often without receiving any recognition for their contributions. Victoria opened the book, titled Hidden Hands, The Untold Stories of America's Kitchen Pioneers, and immediately understood its significance. The pages contained not just recipes, but stories. Dozens of women like Eleanor, who had worked in restaurant kitchens, developing techniques and dishes that would become foundations of American fine dining, yet whose names had been forgotten by history. My mother's story isn't unique, Dr. Mitchell continued. It's been replicated thousands of times across the country. Women who came here with nothing but knowledge and determination, who transformed our food culture from behind the scenes. Sarah appeared beside them, her eyes bright with excitement. Uncle James has been in contact with food historians across the country. They want to create a national archive documenting these stories. And it all started because of what happened that night at Bellecourt. As the evening progressed, Victoria found herself witnessing something unprecedented. The dinner had evolved into an impromptu symposium on the hidden history of American cuisine. Guests shared stories of their own family members who had worked in restaurant kitchens, contributing to culinary traditions that had been credited to celebrity chefs and cookbook authors. Marcus stood to address the assembled group, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had come to understand his industry in entirely new ways. 2 years ago, I thought I understood what it meant to honor tradition. I displayed vintage photographs on restaurant walls. I preserved classic recipes. I celebrated the history of Italian immigration to America. He gestured toward the manuscript in Victoria's hands. But I was only celebrating the visible history, the stories of men who owned restaurants, the chefs who achieved fame, the entrepreneurs who built empires. I was blind to the invisible history, the contributions of women like Eleanor, who created the foundation upon which everything else was built. Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. This blindness isn't unique to the restaurant industry. It reflects a broader cultural tendency to overlook the contributions of working-class women, particularly women of color and immigrants. My mother's story represents thousands of similar stories that have never been told. Victoria realized that the transformation she had initiated extended far beyond customer service or management philosophy. By insisting on dignity and recognition for all people, she had inadvertently sparked a movement to recover lost histories and acknowledge forgotten contributions. Carmen, now confident in her role as a restaurant owner, shared her own experience. When I opened my bistro, I made a decision to research the history of every dish on my menu. I wanted to know not just the ingredients and techniques, but the stories of the people who developed them. What I discovered was that most of my signature dishes were created by women whose names I'll never know. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest. Eleanor's former supervisor from the original Bellecourt location, now 91 years old, had been brought by her granddaughter after hearing about the evening through the extended network of people connected to the restaurant. "Mrs. Catherine Rossi," Sarah whispered to Victoria. "She worked alongside my grandmother for 15 years. The elderly woman moved slowly but with dignity, her eyes still sharp despite her age. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed history firsthand. "Eleanor Mitchell was the most talented cook I ever worked with," Mrs. Rossi announced to the assembled group. "But more than that, she was a teacher. Half the techniques that made Bellecourt famous came from her hands, her knowledge, her willingness to share what she knew with younger cooks." She turned to address Marcus directly. "Your father knew this. He used to say that Eleanor was the heart of his kitchen. But in those days, we didn't think to give credit where credit was due. We just accepted that some people worked in the shadows." Victoria felt the weight of this revelation. The story that had begun with a simple act of hospitality had uncovered a much larger truth about recognition, dignity, and the importance of acknowledging all contributions to our shared success. As the evening drew to a close, Dr. Mitchell made an announcement that would ensure Eleanor's legacy extended far beyond a single restaurant or even a single book. "The Eleanor Mitchell Foundation will be established next month," he said, "with the mission of documenting and preserving the stories of working-class contributors to American cuisine. We'll be creating oral history projects, recipe archives, and scholarship programs for young people from similar backgrounds who want to pursue culinary careers." Sarah stood beside her uncle, holding the wooden box that had once contained her grandmother's ashes and now held soil from the small garden plot that had been planted in Eleanor's memory behind Bellecourt. "My grandmother saved money her entire life so I could have one special dinner," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. "But what she really gave me was something much more valuable, the understanding that dignity and respect aren't luxuries reserved for people who can afford them. They're basic human rights that should be extended to everyone." Victoria looked around the room at the faces of people whose lives had been connected by a single evening's decision to prioritize principles over profit. Marcus, who had discovered that honoring tradition meant more than preserving recipes. Carmen, who had learned that leadership meant creating opportunities for others to succeed. Chef Rodriguez, who now credited his culinary innovations to the techniques taught by women whose names had been forgotten. "When I made the decision to defend Sarah that night," Victoria reflected, "I thought I was just standing up for one person's right to be treated with respect. I had no idea that decision would lead to this, to the recovery of lost histories, the creation of new opportunities, and the establishment of a foundation that will ensure these stories are never forgotten again." The evening ended not with goodbyes but with commitments. Plans were made for additional research projects, for scholarship programs, for restaurant partnerships that would continue to honor the invisible contributors to America's culinary heritage. As Victoria prepared to leave, Sarah approached her one final time. "You know, I think my grandmother would be amazed by everything that came from that one dinner. But I don't think she'd be surprised. She always believed that when you treat people with dignity, extraordinary things happen." Victoria smiled, understanding that the lessons Sarah's grandmother had taught them all extended far beyond the restaurant industry. In a world that often measured value by wealth and status, they had learned that true worth came from recognizing the humanity in every person, honoring the contributions of all people, and ensuring that dignity remained the foundation of every human interaction. The story that had begun with "you can't afford this" had become a movement proving that everyone could afford and deserved respect, recognition, and the opportunity to have their contributions acknowledged and celebrated. In the end, Eleanor Mitchell's legacy lived on not just in recipes and techniques, but in the understanding that authentic hospitality, like authentic leadership, meant creating space for every person's story to be heard, valued, and remembered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.